The boy in the devil costume. I hate Halloween for many reasons. I have to answer the door every 10 minutes. I have to pretend like I'm excited to give bratty kids free candy. I have to stay inside, because driving on a road filled with crazy, running children gives me panic attacks. I plopped down in the chair by the window. Hordes of children in garish costumes ran down the sidewalks, shepherded by tired mothers. I sighed as a group of children crossed the street and started towards my house. Ding! The doorbell chimed, echoing inside the house. I heaved myself up, grabbed the bag of Milky Ways, and walked towards the door. Trick or treat! 5 kids stood on the doorstep. A few princesses, a Batman, and a devil. I unceremoniously grabbed handfuls of candy and plopped them in each kid's bag. One murmured thank you, the rest were ungrateful little brats. Can I have more? Advertisements. I looked up. The devil kid was staring at me, holding out his bag. His blonde hair shone in the porch light. His eyes were a piercing ice blue. There was something oddly familiar about him, but I couldn't place it. Sure, I replied. I dropped a few more Milky Ways in the bag. He didn't thank me. He just silently turned around and walked off my porch, following the other children. I shut the door and returned to my perch by the window. I watched as the 4 children walked off my lawn, joining a mother at the end of the driveway. Then the group disappeared into the shadows of dusk. Scarcely 2 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. Ding! I grabbed the bag of Milky Ways and tromped to the door. I straightened my blouse, plastered a smile on my face, and swung the door open. Trick or treat! A similar mix of kids. 2 Elsas, Marshall from Paw Patrol, and a ninja. How scary you all look! I said. They giggled and swarmed around for the candy, all except for the ninja. He stood back from the rest, silently watching. His entire face was covered with black cloth, save for his chilling, blue eyes. Thank you. The kids cheered, stepping off the porch. As they did, the ninja kid stepped forward. His eyes glinted under the porch light, and even though his mouth was covered, I could tell he wasn't smiling. Can I have more? He said. My blood ran cold. It was the same voice. I stood there, in the doorway, frozen. The Milky Way bag hung limply from my hands. There's no way he could have changed costumes that fast. How can it be him? This must be some kind of joke. Can I have more? He asked again. I snapped out of my thoughts. Sure, of course, I said. I threw a large handful of Milky Ways in his plastic jack-o'-lantern candy bowl. That's when I noticed it was empty. If he'd been trick-or-treating all evening, how could it be empty? Hey, I said. Are you okay? But he had already turned away, running back across my lawn. In seconds he was gone, camouflaged in the dusky shadows, among the fellow trick-or-treaters. I sat back down on the chair and stared at the floor. I didn't want to look out at the swarms of kids anymore. I just wanted to be alone. Those blue eyes. I know I've seen them before. And not under good circumstances. Whenever I'd seen them before, something bad or embarrassing must have happened at the same time. Seeing them again filled me with an inexplicable dread. I ran my fingers through my hair. Maybe he came to my house last year. But that didn't make sense, either. Last year, I'd been over at my ex-boyfriend Drew's house. We'd gotten into a terrible fight that lasted for hours, and I'd left late. I hadn't handed out a single piece of candy. Tap. My head jolted up. Tap tap. Through my own reflection in the glass, in the dark shadows of dusk, I could make out something. A pair of blue eyes. I jumped back with a terrified shriek. Then I grabbed the cord and pulled. The blinds dropped with a clatter. Thump thump. His footsteps raced over the damp grass, fading into the night. Who the hell is he? I didn't have time to think about it. Ding. I didn't move. I didn't want to answer the door and see that kid again. Ding. Ding. But I also couldn't listen to the doorbell ring for 10 minutes. I heaved myself out of the chair, forced a smile, and swung it open. Trick or treat. My eyes glanced over the trick-or-treaters nervously. A fairy with curly hair, an Incredibles boy with brown eyes, a little girl in a tutu. None of them were him. I breathed a sigh of relief. Here you go, I said with a grin. I was so relieved, I gave each of them about 10 Milky Ways. They squealed in delight and scampered back towards their parents. I slowly pushed the door closed. It squeaked against the hinges, and then slammed shut. I returned to my chair. I glanced at my phone, 8:19 p.m. The din of children outside was finally fading. When I peeled back the blinds, the flow of little costumed figures was heading towards the main road. Within 20 minutes, the noises faded to silence. I flipped through a book, checked my texts, and got comfortable. Ding. I picked up the candy bag, which was now nearly empty. Only 4 fun-sized bars floated in the bottom. I hope it's not more than 4 kids. It wasn't. It was just one child. He was wearing some sort of werewolf costume. The outfit was black, tufts of fur haphazardly taped to his body. On his head was a hideous mask. The plastic snout was contorted into a snarl, revealing yellow teeth. Fake blood dripped from its mouth, caking the fur on his shoulders. "Do you want some candy?" I asked, my voice starting to waver. I glanced at the road. It was empty. All the kids were gone. A terrible dread sunk in my heart. My hand quivered on the doorknob. "Can I have more?" I slammed the door shut in his face. I clicked the locks. I ran to the back door and locked it. I closed the windows. Then I threw myself into the chair and sobbed. The costume was familiar. Horribly familiar. The yellow, sightless eyes, the pointed, plastic teeth, familiar and alien, all at once. I wrapped my arms around my knees and sat there, motionless on the couch, listening to the silence. Thump. I jolted up. Thump. My heart throbbed in my chest. I whipped around, looking for the source of the noise. "Hello?" I called. Thump. It was coming from the living room. I squinted in the shadows, trying to make sense of the shapes. I could see the silhouette of the floor lamp, near the window. The bulky outline of the couch. Something stood between them. Something short with a horrible, contorted face. "Can I have more?" The voice quietly called out of the darkness. How did you get in here?" I scrambled back into the family room. The golden light enveloped me, and I felt slightly better. "He's probably just some lost kid," I told myself. "I'll call the police. They'll find his parents. It's all just some misunderstanding. We'll find your parents, okay?" I said, choking back the fear. "Let me just make a call. We'll get you home safely, okay, buddy?" He didn't reply. Instead, he took a slow step forward. As he came towards the light, I saw there was something terribly off about him. His head tilted strangely to one side. His left arm was twisted and mangled. With each step, his body lurched forward unnaturally. "Are you okay?" I asked. Silence. The fake blood that dripped from the werewolf's snout now soaked him. His pale little hands were covered in the red, shiny liquid. The black outfit glistened in the light. The fur was caked and matted. "Can I have more?" I backed into the family room. I fumbled for my phone. It was gone. I grabbed at anything I could find, and my hands latched onto the nearly empty candy bag. "This?" I asked. "Is this what you want?" The child didn't reply. He took a step forward. "Here, you can have it." In my terrified state, I threw it at him. The bag bounced off his chest and landed at his feet. He didn't pick it up. "Can I have more?" "I gave you more." He looked at me with those horribly familiar yellow eyes. Then he stopped. He stood just a few feet from me, bloody hands hanging stiffly at his sides. I took a step back and hit the wall. I was cornered. "Who are you?" I yelled. My plan to stay calm and call the police was long gone. I descended into panic. "Why won't you leave me alone?" The tiny black pupils fixed on me, and he spoke. For the first time, he didn't ask for more. "Do you remember me?" What are you talking about? Do you remember what you did to me? His high-pitched, lisping voice was muffled through the mask. Do you remember what you did 1 year ago? 1 year ago. 1 year ago, on Halloween night. How could I forget? I was storming out of my Drew's house, fuming, swearing I'd never see him again. Slam. The sound of my car door cut sharply through the night. The engine revved underneath me. The headlights blinked on in the darkness. I wasn't paying attention. I was thinking about the fight. I didn't even glance behind me before I backed out of the driveway. Thump. I never even saw him. The black werewolf costume against the night rendered him nearly invisible. It was over before I knew what was happening. When I ran out of the car and saw the broken, mangled body of a little boy in a werewolf costume, and ripped the mask off to see his lifeless eyes staring back up at me. I didn't call the police. I didn't call for help. I panicked. I got back into the car, drove over the grass, and peeled out of the neighborhood before anyone could see what I'd done. Do you remember Eliza? The child cocked his head at an even greater angle as he stared at me through the mask. Do you remember now? I do. I choked through sobs. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I was upset. I wasn't paying attention. Can I have more? I looked up. He'd taken off his mask. The left side of his head was crushed. Blood dripped down his face, staining his pale skin, caking his blonde hair. One ice blue eye was squashed deep into its socket. The other was perfectly intact. His neck was bent at a horribly unnatural angle. Can I have more? He asked. His lips parted to reveal shattered teeth, a scarred tongue. Can you have more what? I asked. Can I have more time? More time? More time alive. I wish I could give that to you. My breath shuddered in my throat. I wish I could give you life. You can't, he replied. His voice suddenly became raspier, darker. Just give me yours. I stared at him. Numb. Weak. My heart ached for the poor, pathetic, mangled child in front of me. It was all my fault. I ran him over. I did this to him. I can't give you mine, I said. I backed away, further into the room. He advanced quickly, walking towards me in swift, lithe strides. You don't have a choice, he said. What are you talking about? His mouth widened into a crooked grin. Trick or treat. I bolted for the door. I yanked the door open, ran out across the yard, screamed out into the night. I didn't stop until one of the neighbors found me, standing in the middle of the road, absolutely incoherent. That was 1 year ago. In 2 days, it will be Halloween again. I've already seen him. A small figure across the street, dressed in all black. Watching me. Waiting. Wearing a hideous werewolf mask. My son did something terrible on Halloween. I have a confession to make. I have been trying so hard to forget what I saw, but now that Halloween is right around the corner again, all these memories resurfaced all of a sudden. I now know it was wrong to keep my mouth shut. But before I tell my husband about it, and later on the authorities, I want to get it off my chest anonymously. Maybe this will help me confessing to my loved ones. My son, I'll call him Al for the sake of this story, is crazy about Halloween. Each year he dresses up as a zombie. Al loves zombies. Last year he begged and pleaded with me to let him go trick-or-treating with his friends. I used to always come along, but that year, he wanted to go without adult supervision. Just him and his buddies. He was 10 years old at the time and pretty mature already. I was reluctant at first, but after thinking it over for a while, I approved. We live in a friendly rural neighborhood bordering on large cornfields. Everyone knows everyone. I figured that they would be fine. The kid needed his freedom after all. Plus, his friend Amy would come along as well. She was 12 years old already and always reminded her younger friends to behave. However, one last glimpse of uncertainty within me caused me to decide that I would sneakily follow them to keep an eye on Al from a distance without bothering him. Just to be absolutely safe. I did as planned, and on Hallows' Eve, I let my son put on his costume and painted him some spooky zombie makeup, complete with sprinkles of fake blood on his ripped clothing and smears of it around his mouth. He took a look into the mirror and let out a squeal of delight. He hugged me, grabbed his little bag, and rushed outside. I waited a bit before going outside myself. His father wasn't home that night, so I left a bowl of candy on the front porch in hopes of it not being raided immediately. Upon walking out the door, I saw Al run towards a small group of other kids in fancy costumes. I recognized them all. There was Amy in her witch costume, our neighbor's son Mark was a vampire, and there was a ghost whom I could only assume was Al's best friend Blake. I smiled at the sweet sight. It was always the four of them. I followed them at a safe distance, trying not to catch their attention. I watched as they rang at the doors of several houses on their harvest, growing more and more cheerful the more candy they received. It was obvious that Amy wasn't too fond of Al's costume, though. From time to time, my son would scare her by jumping in front of her all of a sudden or making creepy sounds. Amy would shriek loudly every single time before bursting out into laughter. At some point along the way, they began developing Al's zombie scares into a full-on game of catch, my son merrily chasing around the others who, happily giggling, tried to avoid him. It was adorable to watch them play. I knew they weren't little anymore, but it still warmed my heart. They had reached the end of the main road and were still playing catch. They were enjoying themselves and I was content, until Amy suddenly ran off into the cornfield to the side of the road. Al, Mark, and Blake followed her, howling like little monsters along the way. I was taken aback. The cornfields were large and children, or rather residents of our neighborhood in general, were forbidden from entering it. Not because they would trample the corn, but because people had gotten lost in there before. I couldn't help but instantly get worried. I hurried to run after them, but seeing as I was in pretty bad shape, it took me a while to find them. When I finally caught up with them, I found that they had gathered at the side of the field. Amy was still chuckling but completely out of breath. "Give me a second, you guys," she panted. "Ah, come on," Blake argued from under his white cloak. "Playing zombie is so much fun." Al cheered. In the heat of the game, he had completely given up on his usual calm demeanor and was losing himself in a fit of giggles. "Can we keep playing zombie? Please." "Yeah, just give me a second, guys," Amy repeated. She was still bent over and trying to catch her breath. Suddenly, the three boys stuck their heads together and began murmuring something amongst themselves, out of earshot from Amy. "What? What are you talking about?" the young girl asked. "We're playing zombie for real this time," my son exclaimed. I frowned in confusion, but stayed where I was. I watched as Blake and Mark strode towards Amy and grabbed her by the arms. "It's okay, they're just trying to scare her again," I told myself. But that notion was quickly knocked out of me when El suddenly picked up a large stone from the dusty ground, his skinny arms struggling to lift the heavy thing. Slowly, at a pace almost menacing, he made his way over to Amy. I wanted to intervene. I wanted to dash out of my hiding spot and stop him, tear that rock put of his hands. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. Tears began welling up in my eyes and running down my cheeks as my mouth dropped open, trying to form sounds, to somehow produce the shriek I was hoping for, but to avail. I tried to move, I tried so hard, but I just couldn't. My body didn't obey me. I watched in horror as my son lifted the rock above his head and brought it down on the screaming, struggling girl's head. He did it again. Then again. Then again. My son, my child, my flesh and blood, bashed his friend's skull in. Blood was gushing everywhere. Onto my son's hands, his face, his costume. I let go of the stone and knelt down and fumbled around in the remains of Amy's head. I felt the vomit rise in my throat when I realized what he was doing. I remained paralyzed with fear, terror, and disgust as my son carefully picked at the bloodied, gory mess and slowly led bits of Amy's brains to his mouth. One by one they vanished in between his lips like trick-or-treat candy. I didn't stay to watch Mark and Blake join him. When I finally regained control over my body, I simply turned and ran. I ran all the way back home, tears of shock still gushing out of my eyes. I'd barely made it into the bathroom before I started vomiting. When Al came home later that evening, I didn't come out to greet him. I wouldn't have dared to look into his eyes. I wouldn't have been able to. I haven't been able to look at him the same way ever since. I don't know why he did such a thing. Was it my fault? Where did I go wrong? How did my sweet little boy turn into a monster? I've pretended that everything was fine for almost a whole year now. Every time I would run into Mark's or Blake's parents on my way around town, every time I would pick up my son from school, I pretended I never saw what I saw. They found Amy's corpse the day after Halloween. The police never found out who had done it, otherwise, I wouldn't be writing this right now. No suspects were ever arrested either. When they questioned my son, he lied through his teeth. Amy's parents moved away not long after. They couldn't stand being in that home in which they had made so many memories with their daughter. I know I should have told the police, and I hate myself for being too weak to do the right thing. I was scared. Scared of my own son, but at the same time scared of losing him too. I hate myself for not helping Amy. I don't know why I was unable to move, but had I been able to, if I could trade my life for hers, she would be standing here right now. I wish Halloween 2018 had never happened. It has left my son a killer, a sweet young girl dead, and me a guilt-stricken shell of my former self. I'm not stupid. I know that withholding information from the police in a case of child murder has severe legal consequences. I deserve everything that's coming to me. But so does he. I guess I thought telling the truth wouldn't make a difference. It wouldn't bring Amy back to life. But by now I know that those were just the cowardly, foolish thoughts of a cowardly and foolish woman. I know it's way too late, but for once I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to use the blood-stained costume as evidence. I never disposed of it. They're going to figure out which stains are Amy's and which are fake blood, alright. I'm going to name Mark and Blake too. No more Halloween. No more playing zombie. Stories for my daughter. I know they say Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year, but for me it's Halloween. I deck the hall with cobwebs and fake spiders. It's just such a special time. Autumn is here and the leaves are beginning to fall. It's a time for dressing up and suspending reality. We sit in our cozy homes with our jack-o'-lanterns and candy, scaring ourselves, and almost will ourselves to see something otherworldly. My daughter has always loved scary Halloween stories, and last year was no different. We were at the kitchen table, hollowing out our pumpkins and drawing scary faces on them ready to carve. As we scooped the stringy seeds into a large bowl on the table, she asked, "Is it time yet? Time for stories?" "Okay," I smiled at her. "Where should we start? How about the monkey's paw?" No, that's an old one," she grimaced. "Tell me something new." Okay, and I glanced out of the window and saw the moon disappearing behind a cloud. "Right, I've got one for you." And as we scooped and carved, this is the story I told her. Once upon a time, long ago, there was a boy named Jacob, and he lived with his father in a house on the outskirts of a forest. One night his father roused him from a deep sleep. "My son," he whispered, "I have to go out. One of the women in the village is about to give birth, and I must be there." Jacob's father was the village doctor and much respected. "But father," Jacob mumbled sleepily. "What about the wolf?" There had been sightings of a large wolf around the edges of the village and the forest, and the villagers were living in fear. "Don't be afraid, son," his father reassured him. "I'll lock all the doors and windows, and you'll be perfectly safe." The boy's chin trembled, but he trusted his father and agreed to try and go back to sleep. Once his father had gone out, Jacob couldn't sleep. Every noise and creak in the house seemed amplified. He took his blankets from the bed and curled up in front of the window, waiting for his father to return. He saw the full moon through his window and was comforted by the light. Smells of the night forest wafted through his window, and he dozed fitfully. Eventually, he saw the lights from his father's car coming back up to the house. He was so relieved he ran to meet him. Jacob's father saw a huge wolf bound out of the house towards his car. But before he could do anything, he heard the sound of a shotgun, and the wolf fell to the ground. From the edge of the forest, a group of villagers appeared. They had formed a posse and been out hunting the wolf. At first, they didn't understand the doctor's anguished cry. "What have you done?" he yelled, and he ran to the spot where the wolf had dropped, grabbing its body and cradling it in his arms. As it took its last breath, the villagers were horrified to see the wolf's massive furry body transform back into that of a child. "So the doctor's son was the wolf?" my daughter asked, her brown eyes wide. "That's a sad story, Mommy." "I guess it is, sweetheart, but sometimes horror is sad as well as scary. Anyway, I think these are ready to be lit." Our pumpkins were finished, and we carried them into the living room. We put them on the low table in front of the TV and lit candles in them. Tradition dictated now it was time for spooky cartoons. She'd seen them many times before and quickly got bored. She picked up a dusty pack of tarot cards from the table. "Tell me my future, Mommy." I sighed. "I don't like to use those anymore, honey. How about I tell you another story?" "Is it about tarot cards?" she asked. "No, although the magician in it did use cards to do some of his magic tricks. This story is called Smoke and Mirrors." She curled into me on the sofa and I began. Once upon a time, there was a man, and he made his living doing magic tricks. He did children's parties and very small venues. He wasn't very good, and most of the time people could tell when he switched cards or pulled things from up his sleeves. Then one day he was browsing the local newspaper when he saw an advertisement. "Free to good home. Pair of magic cabinets. Amaze your audience." Well, he was very keen. He didn't earn much money, and that was the kind of thing he would love to use in his act but could never afford. He quickly rang the number on the avert and arranged to go pick them up. When he saw them, they were more than he could have ever hoped. They were roughly 6 feet tall and hexagonally shaped. Each outside wall was covered in full-length mirrors. The doors on the front swung open noiselessly, and the interior was lined in plush black velvet. The magician couldn't believe his luck, and asked why the man was just giving them away. The seller just replied that he had no use for them anymore. "So, how do they work?" asked the magician. The seller disappeared back into his house for a moment, and came back carrying a large cage with a parrot in it. "I don't know how this works," he admitted. "It just does," and he put the parrot into one of the cabinets. He walked to the second cabinet, and knocked on the door 3 times. "Welcome back," he boomed in a very theatrical tone. A hissing sound came from the first cabinet, and smoke could be seen coiling from the cracks around the door. He opened the door of the second cabinet, and there was his parrot in its cage. "Oh, these are marvelous," squealed the magician excitedly. He loaded them into his dilapidated old van. "Just one word of caution," said the seller. "When I procured them, I was told under no circumstances to use a human being when doing this trick. I suggest you invest in a parrot yourself." The magician nodded his head eagerly and went on his way. After this, things quickly picked up for the magician. While the rest of his act was still mediocre at best, people were very impressed with his magic cabinet act. He would leave the cabinets where people could examine them during his performance, and do his transportation trick last. For most of his act, the audience would be barely watching, poking and prodding at the cabinets, and trying to work out their secret. The magician was very proud of his new act, but something was bothering him. He currently used either a rabbit or a goldfish in a bowl for his cabinet trick, and he felt there was something a little dull about that. One day, as he was reaching the finale of his show, he realized his rabbit had escaped. He tried to explain, but the audience began to jeer him. Someone from the crowd shouted out that they would quite happily get into the cabinet. In desperation, he agreed. A tall, muscular man made his way through the audience and got into the first cabinet. The magician was very nervous. He knocked on the door of the second cabinet and loudly announced "Welcome back." Clouds of hissing smoke roiled from the first cabinet, and the door of the second cabinet swung open. The tall, muscular man stepped out. He looked a little dazed, but none the worse for his experience. The audience clapped, and that was the show over. For the next few months the magician carried on with his show, sometimes 2 performances a day. Only now he used audience members for the transportation trick. He thought it looked more impressive, and the audience loved it. One evening after a busy day, he was sitting relaxing watching TV, when he saw something that made his blood run cold. There was a story on the news about a man who had gone crazy and killed his family with a kitchen knife. The magician recognized the man instantly, the tall, muscular man who had been the first to go into his cabinet. He couldn't eat or sleep, and nagging fears ran through his mind. In the end, he determined to go visit the killer in prison. He faced the killer through a thick glass pane. He picked up the phone on the wall next to him and gestured for the prisoner to do the same. "You may not remember me," he began. "Oh, I know who you are, Magic Man," the killer interrupted. "And I'm glad you've come. I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" stammered the magician. "For what?" "Why, for welcoming me back into the world," smiled the killer. "I don't understand." "It's so much cooler here," the killer smirked. "So much cooler and so many opportunities." "I don't understand," repeated the magician. "Why did you kill your family? What happened in the box?" The killer began to laugh. It was a sound that chilled the magician to the bone. "So it was an accident?" He laughed harder. "You stupid little man, didn't you know? Your cabinets are portals. We have been watching and waiting for so long. We can't fit into parrots or fish or rabbits, but give us a human body. A demon can fit nicely into a human body. How many people have passed through your cabinets, Magic Man?" And with that, he dropped the phone and got up and walked back into the prison. The magician sat numbly. In his estimation, it was well over 100. Oh, my daughter's eyes were like saucers. So, 100 demons on the earth? Oh, at least I chuckled. I'm not sure the magician's maths was very good. Anyway, baby girl, it's getting very late now. It's time we tucked you up in bed. We headed up the stairs and got her settled. She was very sleepy now. It had been a long night. "Tell me the Halloween story, Mommy?" she asked. "Now which story would that be?" I teased. "How about the one about the hitchhiker?" She shook her head. "The Halloween story, Mommy," she giggled. Okay, I smiled. "Now you're sure you won't have bad dreams?" She shook her head more vehemently and grinned. I would never understand why my daughter loved this story so much, but I began. Once upon a time there was a kindly queen, and she lived in a big castle in a kingdom far away from here. Her husband, the king, however, was mean and cross almost all the time, and one day he threw her down the castle stairs. The queen was badly hurt, and after that, she couldn't have any children. She had always loved children, and every Halloween she would invite all the children from the surrounding village to the castle, which would be decorated with hundreds of carved pumpkins and thousands of candles. She'd give them the finest treats, and the children always had a wonderful time. Eventually, the king died, and the queen was left alone. Now, I know you probably think she'd be pleased that the evil king was dead, but all that happened was that she got more and more lonely. She realized what she had missed out on in her life and became sad and bitter. Her heart grew cold and black. She would look from the castle tower and see the little children playing in the courtyard, and it no longer gave her joy. Their laughter grated on her like nails on a chalkboard, and an evil plot hatched in her mind. The next Halloween she shooed the cooks and the maids from the kitchen and prepared all the Halloween treats herself. They were the most sumptuous candies and cookies, made with only the finest ingredients. There was one ingredient she used that had no place in her recipes. She liberally mixed rat poison in with the sugar, and there was sugar in everything she made. Just like all the years before, the children came to her Halloween party, and like every other year, they stuffed themselves with all the goodies the queen had provided. As usual, they all had a wonderful time, and at the end of the night their parents came and took them home. That was a terrible night in the village. Some of the children were terribly sick, and a lot of them even died. I heard a tiny snuffle from my daughter and looked down to see her sleeping peacefully. I kissed her forehead and made my way quietly out of her room. If she made it to the end of the story, she'd always say, "And that's why I'm not allowed to go trick-or-treating, isn't it, Mommy?" I thought back to the inspiration for my cautionary tale. That terrible Halloween night 6 years ago, when some crazy woman had poisoned the children's candy. The sound of sirens filled the night air, and there were parents panicking and crying in the street. My neighbor came rushing out of his house, holding his limp son in his arms. The jack-o'-lantern on the step tumbling down in front of him and splattering into mush on the sidewalk, while he made a noise of pain so terrible it barely sounded human. I stood on my porch and stared at it, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding in front of me. Some of the children were dead before an ambulance even arrived. The clock on the mantelpiece downstairs struck 12, pulling me back to reality, and I turned and looked back into my daughter's room. The witching hour had come and gone, and our special day was over. Her bed was empty,